Shy Guy Talks, Episode 3. Previously on Shy Guy Talks, Tony Dillon interviewed me on goals, on overcoming your fears, and why I decided to go travelling and come to China specifically.
Remind yourself that everything will probably be fine, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But the consequences of not getting out of your comfort zone and challenging yourself will be long-term agony, because there will always be that slight dissatisfaction.
My guest for this episode is Landry Harmon, the American writer and collaborator with Thaddeus Russell at Renegade University. We had a fascinating conversation about Western cultural attitudes to China.
I think it's kind of good to make a kind of interesting dichotomy for the West between like Japan, which I think we have a kind of really good image of just because of how much media has been presented there. Of course, there's stereotypes and things, but generally I think people have a kind of a good perspective of what Japan is like. Whereas I think China is like, it's all kind of Cold War rhetoric, you know, usually, at least when I find, especially in older people.
Time is 10:15 in the morning in China, and there's someone playing a zither somewhere in my building, so apologies to anybody who can hear that. This building is very loud, and it's either construction, zithers, somebody playing music out of their speakers, or the fighting couple upstairs. So hopefully the stars align and the sound is good.
Yeah, a modern orchestra of China. It's a good soundscape.
Yeah, it's a noisy country, and they're constructing everywhere.
It is.
So
yes,
you can't really escape it unless you go real deep into nature.
Yeah.
Where are you?
I'm in Austin, Texas, which seems like it's like the place popping off. We got, you know, Elon Musk and Joe Rogan at the same city, so it's bound for something. I don't know, good or bad. Depends on who you ask, I guess. But that's where I'm located right now, in my student apartment. You might be able to hear the washer going, the washer and dryer going, but I think it should be quiet enough. It's not that bad.
That's fine. I'll add some bass to the orchestra we've got going on here. So Austin, Texas. The only thing I know about America is from movies. So what do I know about Austin? Richard Linklater, Alex Jones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
And now Joe Rogan. It has a sort of relatively recent modern history of attracting alternative type personalities, slightly out of left field culture, you know?
Really, like I've been reading a lot of kind of history about Austin, going back to its founding as one of the, you know, as one of the first cities in Texas, you know, and Texas was kind of, what's interesting about Texas history compared to other United States, or states, is that it was its own country before. It was its whole own independent country for about 13 years, and then it joined the Union, and then it seceded from the Union in the Civil War, then it lost, and then it joined the Union again. But Austin has always been like a weird, kind of wacky place because it's not necessarily very commercially viable in terms of like location, so you always kind of got weirder people. It's always been the political capital, but never the economic capital. So it's always attracted weird people, you know, and the oldest business in Austin that's still around today is Scholl's Garden, which was like a live music venue and beer garden, basically. So it's like, it's always kind of been the way it has been, even how it's seen today, where it's like, oh, music and weirdos and all that. Like it goes back now, and now is just kind of a more modernized version of it. And it's not as weird as it used to be. I think it's kind of becoming corporatized, which is sort of the sad fate of the city. But yeah.
Yeah, and our main man Michael Malice, is he moving to Austin?
He has a lot of friends here. I know there's the guy Ryan Holiday is one of his good friends. He's the Stoic guy. He does a lot of that kind of material. I think, and he's also done stuff about the Gawker case and Peter Thiel. That was another book that he did. But he lives in Austin, so he has a lot of friends here, and obviously Joe Rogan's here, so he's coming here for that and then other things. So I don't know if he's decided. I think he is debating right now, which a lot of people are debating, especially if you live in New York City or San Francisco or LA, is like Miami or Austin has kind of become the debate amongst people who are like looking to flee those places.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Although you have to say it's sort of inevitable, even within cities, certain neighborhoods become more popular and then attract the artistic types, the alternative types, and then they move on after a generation or so, and then a new place becomes gentrified,
right.
so to speak.
Yeah.
But so where do you see Austin in this curve? Is it at its peak, or is it on its?
It depends. It's like if you're someone who's looking to work in the tech industry and you want like a nice, cool city that doesn't come with high tax rates and doesn't come with a lot of the things that have been pitfalls in some of these cities that people are fleeing from. And, the COVID lockdown has been really the thing, I think, that's exacerbated or more so shown the underlying issues that always kind of been happening as far as the distinction between living in a red state versus living in a blue state. And Florida and Texas are both red states, Republican ran. And that's really been the shift, I think, is why people are seeing these places as lucrative, especially white collar people who are trying to pay less on taxes, or in Joe Rogan's case, getting $100 million deal and not wanting to be taxed under, California law and rather in Texas. So there's a lot of those reasons why it could be lucrative, but I am sort of pessimistic on the keep Austin weird part, which is like what I've always kind of been drawn to. And that's like the slogan of the city is just like, we've had a 29% increase in house rates from last year, which you're just going to price out all the weirdos, the artists, all the people who are usually like the people that make the culture interesting. They're usually on the lower income bracket, not the higher income bracket. So
you were talking about real estate policy and how it sort of encourages the city living in China and how that relates to Austin and the United States in general.
I just think it's kind of interesting to see how certain countries structure the economic incentives in a way that result in particular behavior. And those obvious, like in China, as I was pointing out, is just another analogy. Is just like very obvious that a lot of benefits are built into living in the major cities, and that's even tiered. The higher the tier you go, probably the higher paying the job is, depending on obviously blue collar versus white collar. But in the U.S., a lot of the economic incentive is about property ownership and home ownership, and that's been the tax structure post World War II. Is that like you get to declare on your taxes, so you don't have to pay as much taxes. So a lot of like wealth creation, especially for the middle class, has always been in buying a house, selling houses, and then accruing property that way, right? And this results in sort of like, in my opinion, kind of like a market distortion. I don't know this many people would be owning property if the tax structure was set up, if it wasn't for the tax structure the way it is set up today, which results in these kind of weird bubbles that we get right now, like in Austin, where it's just crazy housing. But that's also part of just like, very sudden economic trends with the coronavirus and people's kind of dissatisfaction with these major cities like New York City. So it's not completely like a market distortion, but my hope is that this will result into building more housing in Austin, hopefully making it more affordable in the long term. Whereas San Francisco, because people protect because a home is your like main equity, you want to defend that property as much as possible because that's your main asset, right? So that has led to that viewpoint of you don't want people building other housing, especially like multifamily and more dense housing around you, because that will depress your property value, right? So that's sort of the thinking that's gone on in San Francisco, which results to like the NIMBYs, which are not in my backyard kind of movement. And that's my hope, is that Austin will be able to kind of circumvent the things that San Francisco has done, and hopefully result into a city that is both pro-growth but also affordable for people who make it interesting as well. Like that's sort of because it's going to change one way or the other, and I think there's kind of the weird people who are hooked onto nostalgia that think it will never change, and it has to change. Like things are going to change, and it's just like, is it going to be more in line with what it used to be, or is it not going to be in line with that? And that's the real question. So that's kind of my point of view.
Yeah, I agree. I have that hope as well. We have a big problem in the UK as well with NIMBYs. We have a severe housing shortage, and it's one of those things where the public policy makers within these towns, they are beholden to the people that already live there. So they're already advantaged by already having property in these places. So of course, the people who are looking for the affordable housing, looking to move to commuter towns, places like this are at an inherent disadvantage. They're outnumbered basically by these NIMBYs. It's very sad. So as someone who's looking to buy property within the medium term, I'm thinking now, is a Western country really going to do it for me? Unless I just want a shack somewhere, which is fine. I could cope with a shack, but
Is there? I'm curious because like we're still sort of seeing this in the United States, where especially like kind of millennial white collar professionals are moving to kind of really more affordable cities because of the kind of prevalence of telecommunicating in their jobs during the pandemic. Has there been any kind of retreat to the countryside in England or any of that kind of pattern because of just like the cost of living in like a London or Manchester or whatever?
Well, London in particular has become unaffordable for most people. In the most expensive areas, it's mostly foreign investors who hold the property there. And then the rent is just inordinately high. And eventually, even though you do get the benefit of a high paying job in London, it's basically the economic hub, the city. If you want to have a high flying career, basically. Some are finding that it's not really worth it. And then, so there are predictions, as far as I know, that, and there are already movements in this way, that people will be going up north to some of the northern cities that may spur a kind of renaissance in cities like Liverpool and Manchester. And at the moment, I've been researching this myself. The best value for money in terms of property is in Scotland. So it's very difficult. My sister lives in London and she pays a crazy amount of rent, and it's ridiculous. So now I'm thinking of going abroad, and but China itself is difficult because it's very difficult for foreigners to own property in China. Usually what people do is they get married and then they sign it in their partner's name, and then that's how they do it. So what is it? I want to talk about your relationship with China. So you studied in China. What were you doing?
I was doing basically a language program at Tsinghua in Beijing for fall of 2019. So basically, I left in January, started right as kind of the burgeoning news of the pandemic was going on. And that was kind of my interest. I was like studying international business, and that's kind of been my major. And part of that major is studying a country and studying its language. So I was kind of interested in China. I think China is going to be, at a very young age, or as like growing up, I was like interested in China just in a very kind of an exotic way, which I think most people, when they look to Asia from the West, it's just kind of like so different, where that's just the initial thing. But then as you study more, it's just like a fascinating modern history and how much change has occurred, especially in the past couple of decades. And then also, I just think like really like the 21st century is definitely going to be kind of positioned around what China does or how people react to China. So that's kind of like, for more strategic reasons, like that's kind of also my interest in China. But that's sort of my budding relationship with China as of right now. And that's why I went there to study for a semester.
Yeah, so you like a lot of us, had this exoticized image of China before we went. And it's very unique, I think, because we live in a very sort of, we have this knowledge about the world, but when it comes to China, people are still like, oh wow, the land of China, in the Far East, this magical land. Well, what goes over there? Is it bad? Is it good? Who knows? When you finally went to China, what surprised you the most?
Oh man, that's a good question, because like you make a very good point, and I think it's kind of good to make a kind of interesting dichotomy for the West between like Japan, which I think we have a kind of really good image of just because of how much media has been presented there. Of course, there's stereotypes and things, but generally I think people have a kind of a good perspective of what Japan is like. Whereas I think China is like, it's all kind of Cold War rhetoric, usually, at least when I find especially in older people. But man, the shocks. I remember just like getting off the airplane, getting in a taxi, and being sweating nervous because I had to like use my broken Chinese to try to convince a taxi driver of what gate my campus was. Like I had to go to a specific gate because like the campus I was on was twice the size of my one here in Austin, which is already kind of big for US size. And if you didn't get into the right gate, you'd be like carrying all your luggage, like miles.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that was like my first reaction was just like the language barrier, obviously. And then from there, it was just like, I remember being in the taxi and just like seeing that like this, again, it's like, I had this image of China, but then you still see like outside of like the Shanghai skyline, outside of like the Forbidden City, what does like just the regular architecture look that makes up where most people live and how like life is kind of conducted. And that's something that like just had a very initial shock to me of just like, wow, this is like just viscerally different, right? Is that visceral difference? So that was like some of my initial reaction to life there. I found like how sprawling Beijing was in general was kind of a really interesting thing that I discovered while living there. But if you're looking for like more conceptual and cerebral things, like I think the idea, and we're still facing this today, the idea of like party membership as a thing and why certain Chinese individuals seek party membership is kind of something that's not very well understood in the West. And I had a neighbor, or my roommate, I was lucky to live in a dorm that had like, I was paired with a local Chinese student, whereas most international students don't. They live like with other international students, but I was actually paired with a student, and he was a like party member, and he had to do these like monthly meetings and stuff like that. And I was reading some bit, so I was kind of able to ask some questions and kind of further understand what are the benefits that come with being a member and all these kind of things. So that was something that was interesting, where I got to kind of transcend my purely book-based knowledge into like real more personal knowledge via talking to him and like learning from him. But yeah, it was just, I mean, China, it is challenging in the sense of just like culture shock, I think, especially compared to like any other countries. It's very different. Language barrier is pretty great, at least where I was. So that's some of the kind of initial reactions I had at the very least. So
yeah, I do think there is a culture shock in China, but it's in different ways than you might expect.
Right.
I came to China with a sort of preconceived idea about how totalitarian it is in day-to-day life. Okay,
right.
So I'm thinking, I don't know what I was thinking exactly, but the little things surprised me. The little things like how normal supermarkets are, and things like this, the day-to-day life of normal people. And sometimes I want to sort of convey to people who don't know about China a sense of the normality of life here, that it's full of people who have the same desires as you. They're still worrying about their bills. They're still looking for girlfriends or boyfriends eventually to marry. Their mates are pissing them off. When they have days off, they go out and play basketball,
Right.
And that seems silly, because if anybody really thought about it, of course it would be like that. But I still, this sense of people have an idea that there's a sense of alienation, like there's this very strange country over there, as if it's a different planet, not even fellow human beings, which I find really strange now that I've been here. And so part of the thing I'm doing with my YouTube channel is showing, hey, look, a supermarket. Hey, look, basketball, things that are normal.
Right.
And my father, who, and this is not really through any malice, when he saw my video in the supermarket, he said, I was shocked how normal it was. But then he himself could not explain what did he expect would be different, except maybe being poorer, you know.
Right.
Which is another aspect. People don't understand how rich China is.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it happens so quickly.
Right. Right. And I think that's like, again, I think a large portion of this thinking is like still in the refraction of this Cold War era of like either the Soviet Union or like Maoist China. It's like people know that it's obviously developed and they can see. I think most people have kind of some inkling, but you're right. That's like the totalitarian idea, especially the one of like a kind of a Soviet kind of project. I don't think that really exists outside of like the boundaries of North Korea. And like this was most pressing to me when I traveled to the border of North Korea in a small city in like Liaoning province called Dandong, which is along the Yalu River. And literally they have like, I tried to explain to people, like they have a KFC, they had a Starbucks there. They literally had a Gucci store. And like, these are Western luxuries that you find like, you know, dime a dozen in a lot of major Western cities. And they're all kind of littered across China as well, which is maybe like a point of how much space in the 21st century has been commodified in this kind of neoliberal project, right? It's like there's something interesting happening in large parts of the world, especially some places are more conducive to it versus others. Like for example, like Italy is like, you go to some Italian cities, they'll have like McDonald's, but like no Italian person goes to eat at McDonald's except for like tourists, right? Like they have these places, but generally speaking, their culture is like, we're going to go to family owned places. And that's sort of how the culture is. Right. But then there's other places that are more under sway of like brand names and places like that and Western establishments. And it's kind of interesting to me how much of the world is kind of being like cookie cutter. And a lot of these stores are popping up all along the place. And I think that's good for like standard products and standard interactions is sort of what you can expect. But in the same sense, it's kind of interesting. It's like, I hope we're not going towards a world where every city is becoming more and more similar, right? Which is like, that was also kind of something interesting, is that there is like, you can find that similar, like as same thing with the regular grocery store. I was like very shocked that it's like, oh, but there's something about like, sometimes people have just figured out the best way to do things, right? Like how should the structure of a grocery store be set up? And then like, you're not going to get that much aberration in that concept because most people have kind of figured out over time what the best idea is. So there's some kind of expectancy that there will be a conformity as things develop and as luxuries and prosperity comes around the whole world, right? So there will be a conformity just via that. But there's definitely a notion in the West of this like, yeah, it's just like, that everybody's living this totalitarian thing and everybody has to like check in their papers at every corner. Like I noticed this like just by talking to my parents and my grandparents after I came back. Definitely. It's definitely there. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see. So, so how long did you spend in Beijing?
So I was in Beijing from August of 2019 to January of 2020.
Okay, so not
about
that
6
long.
months. Yeah, not that long.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And you came back at the worst possible time.
Right. I was like legit because like I mean I was in major rail stations in all of that January month, and then I did a week trip to Tokyo, and then I came back home, and I felt sick when I came back home. And this was like in the United States, and I'm sure like in England as well, there's like just a general kind of, oh, this is happening over there, it's like it wasn't necessarily here, but like I had a fever and I was waking up in the middle of the night and I was like, okay, I got to go to the doctor because it hasn't gone away. So I went to the doctor and they tested me like for flu and strep, both came back negative. And then they asked me, have you been out of the country in the past 90 days? I was like, oh no. I was ready for like the hazmat suits and the truck to pull up in front of the clinic. But I told them China, and the lady kind of just shrugged. So I was like, okay, well, thankfully that's not the case. But yeah, I did leave at like the weirdest possible time. And I'm kind of envious because I think it would have been interesting to live there. I'm kind of curious from your perspective. Do you feel like you have some kind of interesting take? Because like now, no matter what corner of the world you go to, you kind of were very near the epicenter that affected everybody. So you have this kind of very interesting story. And that's kind of something I'm jealous of. in a morbid sense, I guess that's kind of not the best way to say it. But
I guess it was very normal, actually. And because the lockdown was so short as well, my entire experience, the majority of my experience of the virus has been through other people in different countries stressing out about it. When it was actually happening here, it was actually, it was okay. There was a little bit of fear in the beginning because we didn't really know what the heck was going on. And then when we initially went into lockdown, it was okay, this must be pretty damn serious. But after a few days, you know, my colleagues, my friends were living in the same buildings, and we just go to each other's houses, and you know, we could order some beers and it'd be fine. So the actual day-to-day life of living in China when that was happening was not that remarkable. So I don't have a particular story to say there. What is remarkable is that it's been a year now since we've been out of lockdown, and life has been relatively normal all throughout that time. And it seems to be drastically not the case almost everywhere else. There's still restrictions. There's still a lot of cases, regardless of what do you think about lockdowns and masks and stuff. Life has been. I've been more worried about my parents and my family and my friends who are suffering way more, and so that was also very strange. And it seems amazingly ironic that the place where it first occurred is safer, or at least freer than everywhere else. And I just find that extraordinarily ironic more than anything else.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's like, you know, at this point, every language and linguistic thing like once in a century, but whatever, it is kind of a fascinating thing to experience. And there is something about, like, I find in Western media of, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, there definitely was this kind of idea of this Chinese model of lockdown and this kind of proliferation of that kind of political structure. You know, this is actually, you know, and Xi Jinping has really been able to capitalize on this moment in terms of propaganda, because there definitely has been a value showing the ineffectiveness of like Western Europe and America in responding to this. And also with the vaccine thing, is this kind of the next episode of this, right? Where it's like the Americans and the Brits are kind of stingy with the intellectual property, you know, and it's a complicated issue because, like, I think most people don't understand the full aspect of that, and has been, you know, doing their kind of vaccine diplomacy, which is just like they're really outsmarting the West in a lot of ways, especially this past year, which has kind of been something interesting to behold. And have you go ahead, whatever you want to respond to that, but.
I felt like there's a strange mindset of people who are against lockdowns or against these restrictions are pointing at China and saying, you guys did it first. You gave us the idea to do it.
Right.
But it's like, okay, but then China had it short and then they opened up again. And the West has been having this stop-start approach, which has been far more damaging, which they've done of their own accord. China didn't force them to do that.
Yes, of course.
So the West is really playing into this, and yeah, you're absolutely right that China comes out looking good out of that, because if something is on the surface seems better, and then it justifies whatever policy they did, you know. So, and of course, any politician is going to take credit for any good thing that happens. So what did you want to ask me anyway?
Oh yeah, I'll ask you this, but before that, it's something that I think is interesting, is that there's still so much unknown variables when it comes to coronavirus in general, and East Asia, no matter where you're pointing at, has generally fared better, right, compared to Western Europe, and even places like Japan that have quite an old population, which you would think would be primary place of devastation and death, has not turned out to be the case. There has been rises of cases in Tokyo, but Tokyo has not locked down, despite being one of the densest and most populated cities in the entire world. And I think part of this might be the cultural kind of idea of Confucian kind of idea of like caring for other people outside of you, not just pure individual concern. So it's just like there's something, because obviously like Japan and Taiwan are democratic, so it's like it doesn't even necessarily this kind of policy or response is not conducive to the whole Chinese political structure, right? There is something else going on, and I know there's kind of debate about like, is the variety that is present in East Asia less volatile than the stuff happening in Western Europe, or is it purely about response, or is it purely because like SARS and other kind of maybe COVID viruses have spread in this area, therefore there's like this already kind of pre-built immunity in Asia? I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions that we're not going to know for like a decade, but it's kind of interesting to see the contrast between East and West this past year in this moment. And the question I was going to ask you is that I know like vaccines and distribution is going around in China. How, for you as a foreigner, are you able to like navigate that process, if at all, if you've been trying to see what that has looked like? Because I know like my friend, my friend down in Shenzhen, she's telling me her parents were like somewhat skeptical of it, and they wanted to use her as a guinea pig. She was young enough, so we were going to send her to go take it. But yeah, so I was just curious about like what have you noticed about vaccine rollout in China?
Now I will just quickly interrupt myself to introduce the next guest on Shy Guy Talks, which is Adam Street, an inspirational writer and blogger, also living in China.
Yeah, I just love the double O behind it. I love the opportunity above the obligation. Because as soon as you feel like you have to do something, there's already an innate sense of, I want to do that.
Subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Substack to ensure that you don't miss each episode of Shy Guy Talks. And now back to my conversation with Landry.
As far as I know, the vaccine that's being distributed in China is different to the ones that are being distributed in the West. They're based on an old style model, and I know next to nothing about vaccinations and how they're made. So I won't comment more on that, to say that I've heard that it's different, that it's based on the old style, and therefore probably less chance of unexpected side effects, because they've had a longer period of time of monitoring it. The way the process is going at the moment is that so my employer has asked if I wanted to have the vaccine, and strongly recommended that I do so. So I and for a while I was like, okay, so when is that coming? And that was about 6 weeks ago. And then yesterday, actually, I got the official card, which I can go to the hospital and get it. So I took the card, but then I decided, okay, I would actually like to research it more, and then I'll make my decision, because it's still optional for me, and it's and also I should still be able to travel, which was the thing that was going to bother me. I was going to definitely take it if it was going to prevent me from traveling, either externally or internally within China, because that's very important to me, and I'm willing to take the risk.
I'm the same way.
So I was going to wait. I was going to do some research and see how that would take me. But then I heard that my colleague Tony, who's also been on the channel, he went down to the hospital to get his, and then the doctor told, some staff member told them there that they're not giving it to foreigners at the moment. That's strange. That is strange. I wonder why that is, and perhaps that is something because every country is prioritizing. I think at the moment in the UK they're prioritizing the elderly, and then it goes further and further down. So maybe they're prioritizing Chinese nationals, and then they'll get to foreigners eventually.
That's the billion.
Yeah, that's a lot of people to get through. So maybe I might have left by the time they.
Because I'd be curious that because if in continuance with kind of this more heavy-handed approach, I guess maybe a good way to place it as far as China's COVID policy and response, but would there be a similar thing like they've been doing where it's like linked to your WeChat account and you have to show that you've been vaccinated? Like, have you heard any talk? Because I haven't been really following about vaccine passport analogous thing that's happening in China. Is there not any?
I've not heard anything about that. As what's been conveyed to me, and everything I
I really absorb about matters like this is through my employer, because I'm still not, my Chinese is still not good enough to be able to really be tuned into the news and social media and things like this.
Right.
And so I get the information in dribs and drabs and when I can acquire it, so no, I've not heard anything about that. The reason why they've encouraged me to get it, they say is purely because of personal safety. They say it'd be safer for you if you take the vaccination, and presumably safer for other people as well. That's how the story goes.
That's like the whole thing right now, is that there's been big controversy as far as in the United States about like, oh, does the vaccine mean you shouldn't be you can't spread it, and this is like the reason why one of many reasons why I've hated the past year is just like the inability of just reasonable discourse to take place. It's just like people don't have, especially when it comes to like America's science scores are probably not the best in the world. Probably for developed countries we're quite low. So it's just like you're already starting off with a bad base structure to build off any kind of discussion or discourse around science or vaccines or anything like that. So that's kind of been the frustrating thing about being a interlocutor in conversations in America, is just like you're starting from a very ground zero in terms of educating people.
Yeah, I agree. I felt it the same way in Britain as well. And the conversation has completely broken down. I don't think conversation is something that is really happening right now. Meaning an honest exchange of ideas, people coming from a mutual understanding that we may have different ideas about the way things work. We have different information, we have different interpretations, but we're still coming from the same place that we're trying to help. I feel like what's happened is I don't know what's happened. I don't know whether this is a wider thing in politics in general, or and this COVID situation has just sort of exacerbated it. But it's impossible to have, I find anyway, to have a reasonable discussion on this, whether it comes to masks, lockdowns, the vaccinations, the combination between vaccines and masks. And I find that it's been easier for me to withdraw from that conversation. And yes, it keeps me happier in some sense, but also I feel like I'm less informed, because every time I see anything about that, I'm just like, I don't want to deal with it. And that's probably really unhealthy. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's like part of me is just because like my I come from a very conservative background, so I'm always kind of getting that in my radar no matter what. Like that's just my background radiation. And then living in Austin, it's like we call it the blueberry and the red in the red state, which is because it's a Democrat city in a Republican ran state. But so I'm always kind of like be able to kind of position myself both. But I definitely think right now the West is at a crossroads in terms of like the liberal order of things, right? And this is something I've been thinking about, and recently today I was watching this kind of podcast with this guy named Josh Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience, talking about China. He came out with a book called Trump, Xi, and Chaos Under Heaven, all kind of about America and the trade war. And it's very interesting what he was talking about. But one of the things that he's trying to mention was that like not to reiterate or recreate kind of this Cold War rhetoric. And this is my spin on what he was saying. I'm kind of elaborating my own thoughts on this, but that like the real battle is between like the liberal order of things and the enemies of the liberal order in the sense of that. And obviously like I see kind of my flavor of libertarianism as an extension of liberalism and its failures and its excesses, right? It's like, how do we push this project further? But like human rights and freedom of speech and some form of enlightenment kind of thinking or rationality and free discourse and free debate. And how do we structure that on a political level within our own country and unite people who are obviously populist in their rhetoric, which populism, I don't think it has to always be bad, but the flavors of populism that we're dealing with, at least in the United States, have not been good by any means. So, and how do we face that within our own country, but how do we also face that on an international level when we're seeing, China's success and export of that kind of politics to regimes in Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever, right? So it's like, this is kind of the complicated question, and it's not going to take, like, I think it will take a very new way of thinking about this that's not going to really correlate to how the Cold War worked, especially if we want to try to be better. Because, like, if you really look at like what the CIA and the KGB did, I think it'd be hard for an alien to pick like which one's the good side. You know, it's like they're quite dastardly on both sides. So in my sense, it's like we should really be thinking about the ideas of this kind of freedom and liberty and this liberal instinct, of course, in the British sense, not the American sense. But yeah, so that's kind of like something I've been thinking about in general to this whole pandemic. Like, that's the background. And there's been a very big breakdown in discourse, especially in Trump, but I'm sure like you guys have your equivalent problems in England.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Before it was Brexit, and when after Brexit was done, we were like, oh yeah, things will sort of calm down now. Let that settle. And then COVID happened. It's like, you know what? I'm going to go live in a rainforest or something, because this is I can't deal with it anymore.
Right.
All right. So there's a lot to unpack. We're talking about the breakdown in public conversation, and we're also talking about your sort of, I don't know whether to call it a mission, your especially in terms of framing what the liberal order is and what it means, and where libertarianism fits in all that. And later I'd like to link that to China as well. But maybe you could elaborate some more. Why do you see that libertarianism is an extension of the liberal order?
Well, you know, there's kind of different flavors of libertarianism, but the two kind of distinct ones are either of a utilitarian kind of quality or a natural rights kind of quality. I don't really mess in the kind of philosophical distinction between the both, but I definitely see because classical liberalism arose in a pre-industrial world, right? It had ideas about common humanity, free speech, the First Amendment, all these kind of individualistic kind of proclamations that occurred, you know, in the 18th and 19th century. And I think in a way, at least my version of it, I don't know if everybody would agree with me, so I'm not, you know, speaking for all libertarians, which is like the worst job anybody could have ever imagined. But yeah, no chance for that. But yeah, that's how I see it, is that it's like we need to see the pitfalls of liberal institutions, and especially the disasters of the 20th century, not only in the fall down of liberal orders like in Germany or elsewhere, but also the fall down of like FDR style kind of progressivism and these kind of things that are very illiberal, in my opinion. And continuingly, at least in the United States, this kind of center left is continually pushing a more illiberal version of what America should be. And that's something I kind of see, is that like we need to respond to some of the problems and the pitfalls of the 20th century and need to adapt and have a forward vision of what society should be. Like, I'm not conservative, right? I don't want to go back to 1776 and go back to this kind of constitutional America. I think that's too far gone, right? You know, there's the famous quote that the anarchist in America, Lysander Spooner, said that like, if the Constitution is a good document, then it has failed to prevent what has happened, or, you know, the whole quote. Anyways, but like my perspective is exactly that. Like, we need to have some forward-facing vision while also having those liberal roots as the foundation of where we're building from, right? And how do we make that better in a world that has more prosperity and more technology, in which a state is not maybe as necessary as it used to be, in a sense that I don't think there's ways that we can work without the state, right? Which brings in my kind of anarchist leanings as well. So, but that's sort of how I would try to iterate it. If you have any questions, I can follow up though.
Yeah. It's one of those things. Conservatism, I find I agree. Who was it that said conservatism is like is an incoherent ideology? Was that Rand?
Yeah, maybe.
Or was it Rothbard? Because somebody said that, because sounds like be Rand. Inherently just against whatever is happening now.
Yeah, it's a reactionary ideology at its core.
Yeah. and so therefore has no principled basis from which you can really build much. On the other hand, I do understand the importance of traditional institutions, and I'm very interested in people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and people like this, and understanding the symbolic importance of ritual and things like this. So, and also the heuristic sense in that if something has been happening for a really long time and it works for people across ages, across nations and borders, then even if you don't really understand it, make a bet that it's actually not a bad idea, you know, or it'll do.
Right.
You know, so me personally, I'm sort of like in the middle of these in these two things. Whilst how do you? So I understand you're in the old sense of the term, a liberal in terms of free speech and all of these principles that are so dear to us as libertarians, presumably, regardless of which sort of quadrant you are in the libertarian sphere. But also, I believe you go even further than that. You're going into cultural freedom and what is the term you were using? So now, to be completely unfair, this is basically so I can arrive at what you're saying. The right-wing populists would call your idea of libertarianism degenerate or something like that. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess so, right? I mean, I definitely think that, I mean, I'm probably a lot more cultural relativist than a Western-centric person might be, especially of right-wing populists, you know, because for me, I come out of like the excess of that, like the Bush era evangelical Christian abortion, you know, all those kind of thoughts about homosexuality. So it's like, that's sort of where I come out of, right? So it's like, I'm very, you know, as I think all people are, kind of react to the environment they grew up in, and that obviously influences their personality and thus their politics. So for me, that's sort of my reaction. But yeah, I do have a concept of cultural freedom that I think is important, right? And we make this distinction with free speech, right? It's like one thing to have a legal amendment of free speech, but then it is also a different thing to have a culture of free speech that respects the ideas of free thinking and debate, right? It's like, what is the point of free speech legally if everybody's thinking the same way, right? If everybody's conforming. So that's my thinking, where I come from. And I'm getting this a lot from Thaddeus Russell, who's like had a major influence on me, especially his podcast and his work, about how cultural freedom and this kind of what we'd say negative freedom, in the sense of freedom from the government, how can those things work together to create not only a freer and more prosperous world, right? Like, this is my problem with like the Hopites, right? Is like, I don't want to live in suburb America with the conservatives and their commune. Like, that's not the world I want to live in, right? It's just like, there has to be some room for people you're not going to accept, right? I think that's also a very liberal quality, right? It's like, I love talking to people that don't think the same as me, right? That don't live the same life as I do, because I think that makes things interesting. And to me, there are like right-wing libertarians that have more of that instinct, right? Which is like, they come out of like, you know, they usually have a Christian ideology in addition to their political viewpoint, which is fine. Like, again, I think like that's what I love about the ideology as well, is like, you know, we could all go our separate ways and live freely, and that's kind of the beautiful thing about it. And I don't think these views are naturally have to be in conflict. But for me, I see cultural freedom as a gateway for possible political freedom as well. So that might be how I explain it.
Okay. I follow that. Now, you were talking to me about China and how, despite the fact that China has been, over the past few decades, been going through enormous economic growth, in the wake of the free market reforms, private property ownership, foreign investment, after Deng, but we haven't seen that parallel to that, the commensurate cultural freedom that we experienced in the burgeoning years of the United States. When you think about the Roaring Twenties, that wasn't just an economic boom; that was a cultural boom as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Why do you think that has not followed in China?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conundrum of most China watchers, right? Is this kind of neoliberal and Milton Friedman ideas that like political freedom and this liberal institutions and democracy and all these kind of things will follow as a result of like private property, rule of law, and free markets, right? This is kind of the philosophy that did, even in Russia, has not been a perfect implementation of that idea as well. So it's like this clearly is not clearly defined, and for me, it's because it misses a whole culture component that comes with freedom, right? It's like, and that's why, in certain senses, that you can't go into Afghanistan and just say, "Here, let's teach you about feminism, democracy, and voting." It's like it's not going to take place because they're not culturally. And again, like I'm more relativist than maybe some other Westerners would be, but like that's just not part of. That's not. It's like transplanting a tree in a different environment. That's not going to grow the same way as it would in a society that has more fertile ground for these kind of ideas, right? And for me, there has always been a lack of cultural freedom, and that became very clear when I was there, especially like in queer spaces, which you would think be cutting edge because they are kind of this oppressed minority in terms of just on marriage equality. How many, I think it's like 80% of gay men in China will marry a woman and fake the rest of their lives, which is just like a horrible statistic. If anybody cares about like, and I think this is what the Western life has to offer, right? Which is like your life matters. It's you, right? That matters. And you do not have to betray your own happiness. This is kind of a random inequality, right? But it is true. You don't have to betray your own values and your own happiness for the collective, right? And again, it's like there are some merits. Look at like Japanese society, they're not very individualistic, but there is some benefits where I see Japan as being more analogous of what China could be, right? There are these freedoms and these weirdos and sexual freedom and all this kind of stuff. And it's not for everyone, but it's there, it's available, and people can partake. And it definitely makes the culture and the whole place a lot more exciting and interesting. So that's where I can see a possible direction for China. I don't think they're going to become like gun-toting Americans any day now. I don't think that's like on the radar whatsoever, but in a sense of like having this kind of unconformist element that allows interesting arts and allows interesting culture to occur. And maybe this is a Western bias of mine. This is something I've been thinking about as well, because like, who are we Westerners who are like, in the history of things, which is like, I think that's kind of the fascinating thing in China's 5,000 years of history. This is something they've been returning to and kind of appreciating more post Mao. And like Westerners have this kind of, art is beautiful. You go to these, from Greek sculptures to industrial skyscrapers, right? It's like it's a beautiful legacy, but China has a really long legacy of cultural products and artistic production and writing and all these kind of things. So it's like that's something I'm trying to debate, is this a Western bias of individualism, or am I onto something here? And maybe it's it could be a bit of both as well. So it's like, this is how I have been thinking about China, is that there is that missing component of individualistic freedom. And how does that come about? Is that it's like libidinal. It's like it's in us and it just needs to be released. And it's just how much of society is pressurized to the point where because of societal expectations, because of familial expectations, right? Like my girlfriend from Japan, she says, Westerners had God, and for most of the West, we've been able to kill God, right? In the Nietzschean sense. And in the East, they have society, they have family, right? It's like, those are the things that judge and conform people, right? In the Western mindset, we had God in our mind, we had God in our body. He was watching us wherever we went. Even in our bedroom, we couldn't, flee him. He knew what we're doing. It's like Santa Claus. He knows what you've done, right? And in the Eastern sense, it's been your society, it's been your family that are the way that values and all these things conform. So this is a different struggle in the Eastern sense of how individualism would work, but and individual pleasure as well. So that's kind of my thinking, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. And it was honest, because it's a sort of like a branch. It's an intellectual inquiry rather than China must be like this. Why isn't it more like this? Like the attitude of a lot of China watchers.
Right. Yeah, and that's my thing. Is just like, China, Japan. Go to Japan. And this is something I think COVID has also demonstrated very well, is that there are clear cultural differences on how societies work that are absent politics, absent everything else. It's just like, it's in the culture. And, I like America for this freedom. And there's just like, even if there are these like mask, stupid people that are like, it's something that shows that there's like a cultural instinct that's just like, fuck you, we're gonna do what I want. And that's something beautiful about it, even if it's stupid on its face.
I agree.
like that America has that instinct. And in the same way, Japan has these beautiful instincts of like not being a burden to everyone and caring about other people around you. And I think if you go to Tokyo and you see the trams running on time and everything all clean and orderly, and everybody's super clean, very nice, this is a product of their culture that has taken thousands of years to kind of procure to this level. And to me, I don't want to prescribe to any society or any people about ways they should live, right? Because this is truly how I believe libertarian persuasion should work, is that open places, create things and allow people of their own persuasion to come in and join you, right? Do not try to, I'm not an evangelical, and I don't want to tell people this is the way to live and this is the best way to live, and you're losing out, which is like, it's not true, because most people, like Western societies, are profoundly unhappy comparatively to Eastern societies, right? It's just like, they have something right. There's something they have that the West is missing. Yeah. That's true. I think it goes both ways. But also, I think there's something about Western society that Eastern society is going to learn. So it's like, it's a mutual trade, in my opinion. That's how I see it, at least. And that helps you coming from like being a Christian missionary like they were 300 years ago when they came to China, which was just like very browbeating, and you don't know what we're talking about, and we're going to colonize you and teach you the right ways. I don't want to be a colonizer. I don't want to be that. And especially Chinese people are very phobic to those kind of people who want to come change China, right? So,
it's a balance you need to strike, isn't it? Because what we're really trying to do is foster cultural communication and exchange of ideas. But it's on the one hand, you have the colonizers, the evangelists, the Jesuit missionaries. And then on the other hand, we have the social justice type thing, which implies something really crazy, I think. The idea that, okay, if you have anything to say about another person's culture, then you are a colonizer. Like if you are even within these spaces and talking about these things in any kind of objective way, then you're guilty of cultural appropriation. But the implication behind that is that, okay, so all of our cultures should just sort of like segregate completely, not talk to each other. And that's not the answer either.
Yeah, I mean, this perspective is just like anti-historical, because all of history, like language itself, is a product of appropriating words and learning things from different cultures in this exchange. It's always happened throughout history. And that's the beautiful thing that markets have allowed to flourish, right? It's like someone said something interesting the other day. It was like, 1,000 years ago, if you lived in a country and someone came to your shores on boats, you didn't know if they were going to murder you, take you as a slave. You didn't know what's going to happen. Now, what's the beautiful aspect about markets is that, like, there is this sense that we can have more exchange and benefit us both than savagery. There's a great Walter Williams quote, who's an economist, saying something along this lines, basically, is that like the markets incentivize these good behaviors, which have been kind of absent because their incentives weren't there for most of human history, right? It's like you were supposed to fear everybody with suspicion. You're supposed to attack everybody who was a stranger, right? And the markets allow you to open up because everybody has something to offer, whether it be knowledge or whether it be products or goods or services, right? It's like everybody has something to offer. And that you can use that in a more cultural and philosophical sense. But you're exactly right about this left perspective of cultural appropriation is just, one, is ahistorically inaccurate, and then also there is need for the exchange of ideas. There's a need for people to learn from each other, and putting these walls down, and one, like essentializing certain people, right? This is what we've been seeing with the woke stuff, right? We're literally seeing Coca-Cola have these like training sessions and for a lot of their workers, saying that white culture is hardworking, shows up on time, it's about the written word, and like these very weird kind of concepts, which is like, this is open for everybody, right? The humanities, no matter who you are. And that's the beautiful thing about, again, the Western project, the idea of humanities and this way of critical thinking and freedom of thought that's like open to everybody of background, race or color or creed, right? It's like, that's the thing we should strive for. And that's the sort of fraternity, right? This equal humanity kind of project that I think is much needed, that like oddly that you came out of the left, yeah, it's sorely missing on the left these days, you know?
Yeah. And these things would be considered self-evident only a few years ago, right? And that would go without saying. But now this is another thing where I feel like the conversation is completely broken down, and there needs to be some healing. Okay, so we're getting towards wrapping up time. I've found this really interesting, really fascinating.
Good.
So can you tell me what you're doing with Thaddeus Russell? So you're helping him out with Renegade University, right?
Yeah, so I'm helping out with Renegade University, basically, and I know it firsthand. College courses are not always the most fun, and especially in my time, not the freest place to speak. Right? There's kind of this conformity of ideas and expectation to say the things. And what Thad has done is created kind of a space where you can kind of learn about ideas freely and openly, and question and argue and debate, and have that kind of space for, let's just say, at least in American terms, a much reduced costs. Obviously, you're not going to get credit out of it, but you do gain a lot just from having these discussions that we're missing, right? Is like, that's, I think, also how do we get back on track in fixing this discourse and dialogue? And to me, there's nothing better than showing people examples of how to go about that. And I really think what happens at Renegade University is a great example of very esoteric topics. We talked about like critical theory, which is becoming more and more prevalent issue and debate, and he kind of went through this as that is a man and child of the left. He knows these ideas in and out, and able to discuss them in a very interesting way and have kind of a very diversity point. He had James Lindsay, who's famous for doing the whole grievance studies affair where he faked the stuff, and he also is very big on this. And they had a very kind of contrasting viewpoints on these texts and all the stuff. So anyway, so now we're kind of doing these webinars where we're going by topics. We're going to go, I'm right now working on research for fascism. We're going to talk about fascism. We're talking about everything from like Black culture to human sexuality to logic and arguments. So anyway, so that's kind of what we're doing, is we're just trying to give people space to learn on weekday nights, and also available in recordings, and you could take place in the conversation. You can ask questions, and you can learn from people who are scholars in those fields for a very reduced cost. So that's kind of what I've been helping them out at in the background. So,
yeah, fantastic. So for anybody whose interest has been piqued by that, where should they go?
Yeah, just renegadeuniversity.com has a list of all the courses there. It should also have upcoming webinars if you want to join one and be there when it's recorded live, or you can kind of watch some stuff in the back catalog. So either way. Yeah,
and on the Renegade University channel, YouTube channel, you can see previous seminars, right? Webinars.
Yeah, they have previous seminars. They have some of the old RU Lives, which is something we're still working out. But there's also trials, and I think we're working on like high production trailers for some of the old catalog courses. So we'll also have some of that on there as well. So, and then also Thaddeus Russell's Unregistered podcast, and then I am his like co-host on his behind the paywall podcast where we like react to videos and all kinds of stuff. So yeah.
All right, sweet.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Landry.
Yeah, you too. Have a good rest of your day.
And that's that for another episode of Shy Guy Talks. If you don't want to miss another episode, subscribe either on YouTube at Shy Guy Travel, Spotify at Shy Guy Talks. You can subscribe to my Substack, Master of None, which shall be linked in the description. Otherwise, you can find it at jamesmichaelsmith.substack.com. See you next time.